With us today is Carole Edmond. She has over 30 years of experience working in healthcare and childcare. She's a strategic advisor for KidsKonnect and the founder of Glassmoon Groups, known for disrupting diverse industries with their forward thinking to change the status quo. Thank you so much for being here today, Carole, and I'd love to kick off this episode with talking about your upbringing and how it shaped you to be the successful woman that you are today.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for having me join you on the podcast. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I think that's such a great question to start with. It's also a very broad question, so I'll try and keep this answer relatively short. I think my upbringing's definitely shaped me. And I think sometimes you don't realise how much until you're sort of reviewing your life and looking backwards. But certainly I come from pretty humble beginnings, brought up by a single mum, so very working class family in Scotland, in a council house, went to state school. My mum had to drop out of the workforce when she was 40 due to, she had rheumatoid arthritis and was pretty ill. And her and my dad divorced. And I think we went through quite a kind of tough time in terms of financially and how she was, because she was a really bright lady, not able to work. But thankfully I went to an incredible high school that didn't have the best academic results, but it had incredible resources and opportunities in terms of what you actually got to do at school. And so I think a combination of my family of origin in terms of those sort of humble, hard knock beginnings, great opportunities at school, kind of shaped some of my entrepreneurial spirit, I think. I think because we had no money when I was a kid, I started to deliver newspapers at 13. So I've got that sort of entrepreneurial newspaper delivery girl, age 13, worked in a supermarket at 16. And then my sort of aspirations to go to university couldn't really be followed through because, finances was a real issue. But also from a social conditioning perspective, there just wasn't an expectation that anybody in our family was going to go to university, and the first person to go wasn't going to be one of the girls in the family. So I went into the full-time labour market age 17 in a steel stockyard, and that was a bit of a shock to the system. I did that for a year, and then I had what turned out to be a very life-changing opportunity to join Bupa when I was 18, and that led to the next sort of 20 years of incredible career opportunities, which is how I found my way into childcare and early education.
Well, it's sad sometimes to say like our own family members' insecurities are projected onto us, and sometimes we lack the support from our own family members, which I feel is something that we so crucially need in order to push ourselves and sometimes have that motivation. But not all of us have family members that are supportive, and we have to carry out that drive on our own merit.
Definitely. I mean, just coming back in terms of your point there, I think you're absolutely right. I think sometimes our family of origin don't necessarily always set us up for life and for the greatest sort of life opportunities. But by the same token, I'm a big believer in if you sort of look at what's happened to you, and even if there's been limiting beliefs or adversity in your early years, it's not what's happened, it's what you can do with that, and how you can, as you kind of mature into adulthood, how you can use that to your advantage, which isn't always easy and it isn't always available to everybody. But I think it's a good point in terms of our family of origin doesn't always set us up well, and I think it's why I became a really big sort of advocate for the early years and for education more broadly, in terms of if you haven't got the best family environment, it's how can early years, so how can nursery, for example, how can the school system support, be part of that broader way to kind of shape people sort of going forward. And so in terms of your question about Bupa, absolutely, it became a life-changing opportunity in terms of when I joined them at 18. I worked in the Edinburgh office in Bupa for 5 years, was promoted a number of times. People just saw potential that I didn't even know I had, because I had a very strong work ethic, which I think made a big difference certainly in those days, and worked for some incredible people who just saw potential and gave me opportunities, and I took every opportunity available, including sort of creating my own one, when I was 23, I wrote to directors in London to say, look, I think we could be doing something better in Bupa in relation to how the back office sales function was structured. Never thinking I'd hear from them again. I call it my kind of letter to London. Anyway, a few days later, got a phone call to say, we like your thinking. Could you come and talk to us? So flew down to London, had a conversation, and literally went back to Edinburgh, packed a bag and came back. And that was over 30 years ago.
Wow. So would you say Bupa was that starting point that absolutely changed the direction your life was headed?
Yeah, I think so. And I think companies can create life-changing opportunities in terms of the work environment and work opportunities. And certainly for me, coming from those sort of working class humble beginnings, Bupa sort of opened my eyes to opportunities, to learning, to figuring out how you could actually use your talents and skills that, when you're in your sort of early 20s, you don't always necessarily know what you're good at and what you're going to go on and do. But I just had different opportunities and met different people that shaped my thinking, that then made me think, okay, what can I do next? But I think my main motivation, and this has been a defining part of my career, is about being in service to other people. In terms of in Bupa, it was very clear, particularly when I came to London, was we were doing this for the customer. And in healthcare, the ultimate customer is somebody who's certainly in health insurance, struggling with their health or needs an operation, needs treatment. And I think once I sort of latched on to you can make a difference for people who are in need from a healthcare perspective, or childcare or social care, that was a massively motivating factor that really tapped into something intrinsically for me around my purpose, my passion, my why. And I think I developed that in my mid-20s in my career in Bupa. And once I had that dot connected around, that was something that was hugely motivating for me. And if you're in the right environment with the right people who are supportive and encouraging and inclusive, and your background doesn't matter, they create opportunities to go on and do things that you didn't necessarily imagine yourself doing, but you take them forward.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite life-changing, and I resonate with you on you create your own opportunities. Sometimes they're not always handed to you. So I definitely believe that if anyone's listening out there, to not limit yourself based off what you have, go out there and explore, and see what opportunities you could seize. And so so from Bupa, then what was your next step or next role? Is that when you worked with Bright Horizons, was it? Did you?
Yeah, so what took me into sort of early education was I'd worked for Bupa for about 10 years at that stage, had an amazing career from sort of age 18 to 28. I'd done a diploma in management studies through the Open University, so I'd had a little bit of a taste of, great work experience, doing a bit of academic study. And actually, I'd been headhunted to go and work for one of the big banks, which I'm so grateful that I didn't follow that path. But
why is that?
Because I just don't think financial services and the banking industry would have been for me. But I was 27 at this stage. I'd worked in different parts of Bupa by that time. I'd been down in London maybe 4 years, and I'd been running a really big systems project, which had given me most incredible experience about back office functions, about front ends, about data. I mean, we were doing some tech developments and whole scale sort of organisational change that, as a 27-year-old middle manager, was an incredible opportunity to get that experience. And I think after 10 years, it was, I thought it's time to kind of go and move to a different sector. Anyway, we had a woman who joined at senior level in Bupa so I think it was 96. I'd got to know her through our induction. Anyway, she was the next sort of CEO designate, and it was the first female CEO Bupa had in its, back then, I think 40, 50 years. And she was a working mum with 2 kids. And I'd got to know her through when she joined the organisation, and because I was running this big project and it was pretty high profile. So when she heard I was leaving, she wanted to do an exit conversation. And so I remember turning up in her office one Friday afternoon, slightly jaded from a night out before with the tech guys.
Typical from this Thursday out with
yeah, but especially when we were running a big tech project and some of these guys were working 18-hour days. And she said to me, it was a masterclass in how to talk to somebody about, their kind of career and where it was going and what you really wanted to do. And towards the end of that conversation, she said to me, look, I think Bupa had just, was stretching the brand into the aged care market in terms of care homes. And she said, I think there's a real opportunity for us to stretch the Bupa brand into to support families and young children. And I think we should look at childcare. And this was 1997. There was no real market. There weren't any big chains at that point.
So when she was pitching this to you or having this chat with you, how did you feel about it?
Well, as I said, I was slightly hungover, so it was probably a good time maybe having the conversation actually, because I was a bit like, childcare. I'm 27. I don't have any kids. I actually don't even really know what you're talking about. But sort of long story short with that, there was something about the conversation that stuck in my head, and it sort of rattled around my head for a sort of few days. I'd had to go back. We'd had a family bereavement. Literally that night, I'd had to go back to Scotland for a few days, and then going back to my kind of hometown and my roots, something clicked into place for me that I can't quite explain. Some sort of dot connected around. It was my granny had died, and when I came back, the CEO or CEO to be sort of persevered with this, and she sent the HR director out to see me, and it was one of those kind of look back now. It was a life changing moment because I agreed to stay and I agreed to start researching the childcare market. And literally started with a blank bit of paper. We did it ourselves. We didn't bring in any of the big consultancies. And my very first nursery visit out to see what was happening was a Teddy's nursery, who we then subsequently 2 years later went on and bought the group. But my starting point was blank bit of paper. We created this spectrum of childcare. There was going to be everything from supporting families around sort of if there was problems with sort of infertility and conception, because Bupa obviously was a healthcare company, right the way through to supporting families with teenagers. And even back then, it was obvious that families would need support around those teenage years and mental health and things, even though that was very much ahead of its time. And it was
all kind of intertwined in the end, like social work, healthcare, and families.
Yeah, it was. When I went out and did the market sort of research, it was really obvious that care, education, supporting families. Now you got to remember, this was '98, so this was pre the .com era, pre kind of the internet apps, all digital content, data, all that stuff. But some of those fundamentals that are still so crucial in the early years sector around how do you create great provision, how do you make it accessible and inclusive, how do you give children the best start in life, and how do you support families to do that? How do you support working
class families?
Yeah, well, I think any family, because I think one of the things that came through, I remember when we were doing the research at the time, and it was before I had my daughter, so I had no concept of this in terms of in my sort of personal life, was we talked to a lot of parents who were what was described back then as cash rich and time poor. So they had money, they had the dual family disposable income, but they were juggling professional lives and careers and jobs and trying to raise children. And so what really struck me was, how do you create a proposition in the early years where you've got high quality childcare that isn't just the bricks and mortar support, but there's content for parenting, there's actually potentially using the assets at the weekend to provide like clubs and that sort of thing.
All around support.
Yeah, it was all about really high quality provision so that you get it right for the children in terms of improving outcomes and the early years experience for the child, who at the end of the day is the day-to-day end user. But also, it was really clear to me that parents needed support. I'm talking 26 years ago, but, the market fundamentals around building an infrastructure that support working parents. And it's still the case 26 years later that the primary carer is the mother, so how do you support mums and dads, and grandparents in terms of creating this network where you've got really good quality provision, but you've got the opportunity to provide this kind of 24/7. And of course, as times evolved in the last 26 years and what's happened from a tech point of view and what's available now in terms of connecting with parents, whether that's, content, being able to see how their child's day is, it's just evolved in a way that back then it was really obvious.
Yeah, it's transformed a lot, especially with the help of technology. And
Absolutely. But back then you could just see the potential for that, even though, we didn't know what the technology was going to look like, and things. So, but yeah, I just had this amazing opportunity to develop this market entry strategy. I remember doing the board presentation in Edinburgh, ironically back in my sort of hometown, and asking for a sort of 2 million budget, which to a working class lass from Scotland, that felt like a lot of money.
Yeah. It still feels like a lot of money now.
It is.
If I would possibly want 2 million
Yeah,
to host,
to develop.
to do
Absolutely.
this or host an event, like, no.
Absolutely. But the point of that story is I kind of went in and with a sort of modest request in terms of, to get going and buy some companies and develop the market entry strategy. And I must have pitched this idea so well. And I think there's something in there about really believing, doing the research, knowing what you're talking about, and then develop a kind of passion and an almost sort of unwavering belief in what you're doing, because that's what I presented on that day. And they said, no, we're not going to give you 2 million. We're going to give you 5.
Wow.
And I remember coming out there just, thinking,
maybe you
oh
could
my
ask
God.
for 10.
Yeah, well, exactly. Well, there is something about, I don't think I've ever under-asked for anything. I think I've always been, that kind of gave me the confidence to say, if you believe in something, ask, make the ask. But, coming out of there, we literally bought the first company, which was a very small business-to-business company.
Taking it back just a bit. So, you're saying like it's important to believe in oneself. Did you really believe that you were you were capable of executing this, like from the moment that you pitched it? Did you have that confidence? Like, did you go in there saying like, I absolutely know what I'm doing? Or
gosh, no, absolutely not. But my granny used to say that I could start an argument in an empty house from the age of 7.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what I've kind of taken that to mean in terms of, if I really believe in something, I will stand up for it. And I will fight, and I will make the point, and I will stand, even if I am potentially going to, that could get me into trouble, or, if I think about that, whether that's a strength or a talent or no, in corporate life, you can use up social capital by really standing up for what you believe in, especially if you're a woman. Yeah. Men are expected to have kind of agency and do this, and they go, oh, look at him, doing his thing. Whereas women, sometimes we can make ourselves very unpopular if we are vocal about what we really believe in. And I think, having researched the market, and as I say, it was pre me being a mum, there was just something so powerful about this opportunity to create something that got it right for children in their early years, and the opportunity to create this infrastructure that could support mums, and dads, but typically dads would be the breadwinner in those days. And I think because my mum had to drop out of the labour market, it was for health related reasons rather than barriers around childcare. There was just something in that for me around playing a part in developing the social infrastructure in this country that enabled parents to work, and particularly women to get into the workforce, that really tapped into my kind of family of origin story around, gosh, if I could play a part in terms of creating, infrastructure that helps give children the best start in life, that was important to me, but also the infrastructure to support working families, and in particular women, to participate in the labour market. There was just something massively motivating, and there was a sort of intrinsic motivation in that at the time I'm not sure I could have articulated. Right. But now looking back, reflecting on that opportunity, did I think I was going to be the one that was necessarily going to take it forward? Not especially. The CEO had said to me, if you're any good, you can run it. And I thought,
you had never done anything like this before, right? Especially working with such a massive budget.
Yeah, but I think when people can see sort of potential and scope in you, and especially I think and it's never a single effort. It's never one person that creates a business. I was very lucky in as much as I was then able to, get some people to come and join me on the team and work with me in those very early stages, and I was lucky that I had that pot of money and we could go out and we could start to do acquisition work. So we bought one company, a very small organisation called Company Kids, and then we bought one nursery, and I spent quite a bit of time in that nursery because I didn't know anything about nurseries, and it was even pre-Ofsted at that stage, so it was still when they were sort of governed by local authorities. And then And then Ofsted, the regulations changed, and Ofsted was then the regulator. And then we bought Teddy's Nurseries, which was 18 nurseries. And that was the biggest acquisition that I'd done. And I worked with the founders of that organisation, one for a year, the other one for a couple of years. And that gave me that sort of general management experience of how do you run an organisation? How do you look at the different parts of it? We acquired other nurseries and we grew organically in terms of brand new nurseries. We went on a growth trajectory. And then 5 years after we got going, actually 5-6 years, the CEO who'd been the big backer of that business in Bupa retired, and the person that took over just did not have an affinity with Bupa operating in that sector, and believed there was, we'd never get to materiality in terms of we'd never scale it big enough to be, to be a sort of viable division. And also I think there was a worry around reputational risk because Bupa's a very known brand name in the UK. And so the decision was made to sell the business. And I was pregnant at the time. I was 7 months pregnant, and I was asked if I wanted to do an MBO, so a management buyout, so we would buy the company. And I remember looking at my belly, being 7 months pregnant, and going, I'm not sure this is the greatest timing to do this. And so the management team didn't buy the company. I literally was in labour when I was finishing documents for the information memorandum to sell the company. And I remember sending the document off to the corporate finance team in Bupa and saying, no, I'm not going to be available for the rest of the day. And the person who received it in Bupa said, she must be in labour.
I was just going to ask you, I was like, is that because you were going into labour?
Yeah, I was literally in labour.
Oh, wow,
I never forget typing this document and breathing through my contractions. And she was pregnant actually herself, a few months behind me. And she said to, the rest of the guys in the team, she must be in labour. And they were like, how would you know that? And she said, she's never, ever unavailable. She works,
She doesn't stop working, so.
Exactly. And sure enough, the next morning they got an email to say, I had the baby at midnight, last night.
Yeah.
And literally after sort of 7 days, I was back on the phone doing calls in terms because we were getting the business ready for sale at that point. I had a very short maternity leave, came back, and my daughter went into nursery at sort of 3-4 months old. So then I became a customer of my own business, which was incredible in terms of, you're running the organisation, you're leading the organisation, working with these incredible childcare practitioners, early educators, and from a professional perspective, but you're also a customer.
But now more than ever, you could actually relate to, your
absolutely,
customer and parents.
Absolutely. And I think it was tough for the team because the nursery that my daughter was at was right next to where the office was in Twickenham. And I was always the last customer to run in the door at like 1 minute to 6. And then when I obviously have a conversation about how the day had been, and quite often they say, hi, are you asking us about Amber's day, or are you asking us with your MD hat on, in terms of, because I could never stop thinking about it from a customer perspective and how could we improve. Exactly right. Business, but Amber and I recorded a podcast just before Christmas in terms of, her Gen Y, Gen X experience, kind of mum-daughter. And, she's very kind about my sort of parenting skills, but I 100% can say that I did the best I could. And a lot of that was supported by working with incredible early years practitioners in terms of seeing what they did on a day-to-day basis in the nursery and learning from them. And that absolutely shaped my parenting abilities and how I raised my daughter. Just having these incredible people, around me. It felt kind of 24/7 in terms of growing the business. And we ran Teddy's for another, I was pregnant when we put the business on the market for sale originally, and Amber was 5, I think, actually, when we finally sold it. It took us 5 years.
I mean, when she was out of the nursery now we could start.
Yeah, exactly. Well, she'd actually started. She was in reception year. And we used to joke in terms of saying, gosh, it's taken us so long to sell this business, and we'd been through so many sale processes with different potential buyers before Bright Horizons showed up. I used to say, gosh, if this goes on much longer, she'll be at university by the time we sell this business. Yeah, but again, that experience of being a parent and being a customer of your own business was life shaping for me, and I'm so grateful to, the team for their kind of patience and willingness to sort of support me both from a parental perspective, but also indulge me when I was there asking questions, which were really about process improvement or how could we do things differently at the handover
Giving
point.
you that true like inside scoop of the day-to-day functionalities of a nursery.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always used to say, it's not just about the nursery day between 8 and 6. If we're doing our job properly in the early years sector, we should be enriching the whole parenting experience, because there should be a transfer of not just information about how a child's day has been and and what their next steps are from a learning outcomes or learning objectives perspective, but we should be helping to upskill parents with all this incredible amount of knowledge that our educators have in the sector, and passing that information on so that we can make the parenting experience a bit more enjoyable. But also when parents are at home with their children, that they can take some of the stuff that the child's doing at nursery, or just the way that things are approached from I'm not a big fan of.
I feel like that's where technology plays a big role in shaping that parent comms, like that relationship. Because again, something that I've mentioned previously in other podcasts is, nurseries tend to be a child's second home, second family, and improving that relationship will, help also with nurseries and their profitability and retaining, or like getting more parents in the door, and again, just giving them that support outside of the nursery as well is really important.
It's huge. I mean, it makes the proposition 24/7.
Yeah.
And I think where back in 98, you could see the potential for that. How do you extend that relationship, that customer relationship, when the nursery's doors are closed, or the weekend? How do you have that kind of relational partnership, in terms of you've not just got your child in a nursery, whether it's 7 to 7 or 8 to 6, whatever the sessional attendance is. You've got this collaboration, you've got this partnership, you've got this willingness built. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's in the best interest of the child, obviously, because that's the primary, the priority, but it's also supporting that parenting journey and making it a little bit easier, or, and whether that's around, basic things like parenting advice around, weaning or potty training, or getting a child ready for school, or how do you cope with when you realise your child can actually dress themselves in the morning, and, you don't have to have that argument over getting dressed and what to wear and things, and, through to just figuring out, can you afford the nursery fees? And I think that's where technology and data and making it as accessible to parents as possible, and from a self-service perspective, is where that's been hugely game-changing. And it's one of the reasons why I love working with KidsKonnect, in terms of that ability to widen that opportunity and that relationship with parents, to just make it that little bit easier.
Right. And how long have you been with KidsKonnect?
So I joined the board a year past December. So we're now about 15 months.
Oh, nice. Great. And what about Glassmoon Group? When did you...
So I set that up. I mean, actually, probably just to finish the story in terms of the Bupa journey. So when Bupa sold Teddy's Nurseries to Bright Horizons, I went across and was in Bright Horizons for 6 years. And that was an amazing opportunity to lead that organisation from about 100 nurseries. We grew it to 200 nurseries at the point at which I left in 2015. We were looking after about 20,000 children. We had a team of about 6,000 staff at that point. And it was just this incredible opportunity to take everything that I'd been working on in the last 10 years and bring it into a bigger organisation and scale it that bit more. I had an incredible leadership team, incredible colleagues across the 200 nurseries, and one of my favourite parts of the job was actually getting out and doing the nursery visits and seeing the team and sitting on the floor with the babies, or being in the toddler room or the preschool room. And, I absolutely loved that. And in fact, I sort of worked out, there's about 6 or 8 people that were in my leadership team in Bright Horizons who are now in CEO or MD jobs in the sector. And that makes me immensely proud to know that, we work together as a team, and everybody's gone off and done, other things. And I was in Bright Horizons for 6 years, and I think it was an incredible journey. Worked super hard. I was raising my. I got divorced just before I joined Bright Horizons, so I was raising my daughter on my own, and I did a master's degree when I was there and started my doctorate there, and we had this incredible growth. So it was amazing at one level, but also it was for me, what I realized at the end of that journey was that I'd experienced a bit of kind of burnout and in that role, in terms of what we were doing, and also over-indexed on work. So when I came out of that role, I realized that I wanted to do something different. I didn't necessarily want to be running a big organisation again. And I sort of dug into my research for my doctorate, and that's when Glassmoon was created. This sort of notion that we can change the status quo, we can do things differently, and the name originates from the glass, comes from all the research I was doing around glass barriers that get in the way of us, developing our career or kind of whole person approach to life. And the moon bit is, my dad was always convinced I was conceived in the night that Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, and he used to call me his moon baby. And so I put those two bits together in terms of the glass, insofar as how do we move the barriers far enough away so that people can, develop and evolve in the way that they want to be, that professionally or personally, or, ideally a combination of the two. And the moon is the willingness to take that moonshot opportunity.
Yeah.
And so it's the sort of, how do we overcome the barriers with, the potential that we've got, in our lives to kind of navigate our lives to where we want to be, personally and professionally. So it was an idea that kind of came to me, and the name came to me really before I knew what the organisation was going to do. And in the early stages, we started with some consultancy work. Some people sort of asked me to do some work for free, which you kind of do when you're getting going and you're figuring out what you're doing. And it was in the early years, so consultancy work for typically private equity funds that wanted to invest in childcare assets or invest in the UK market. And then I got an amazing opportunity to work with what was then called LPCR. It's now Grandier in the UK. And Jean Emmanuel Roro-Kanachi was one of my first clients that actually paid us to do work to help them enter the UK market. And so that's how we got going in terms of the first Glassmoon company. And then the second one we developed was a small digital company, which you're familiar with, our app, in terms of you've been given that a go. Yeah. And then I did go back into an executive role for a couple of years in adult social care, and then came out of that, and a year after that set up Glassmoon Services, and now Home. So that's where we work with the NHS in the Southwest to support adults that have autism and learning disabilities, and who our model supports adults that have got high level of acuity. So, for example, they might have been sectioned under the Mental Health Act and have been locked away in long-stay institutions in some cases for over a decade.
Right, and I tuned into one of your episodes. That story brought me to tears.
Was that Alexis?
Yeah.
Yeah.
She was a swimmer, right? Olympic swimmer, yeah.
Yeah, so she'd, I'm not sure Olympic level, but she'd, in her youth, she'd swam for Team GB, and she'd gone on and she was a teacher, and then had a sort of mental health crisis on the back
after losing her brother.
Yeah, that's right. And went to the GP for a bit of help and support, and long story short, was sectioned for 4 years. And 4 years for the cohort that we support isn't actually that long.
Did you come to find out about her story after the work you had already been doing, or was that before?
No, so after. So we set up Glassmoon Services, and the first person that we were commissioned to support had been in a long-stay institution for 2 years. It's actually a CAM service, so that's children's services, but sectioned and effectively in sort of seclusion for sort of 2 years on his own, no real interaction with other people. So he was the first person that we supported to come out of that long stay institution, bought a property, and developed the organisation from there. And then in the process of running that company and going to conferences, we went to an autism conference, and that's how I met Alexis. And actually, before meeting her at a conference, I'd read her book Unbroken, which effectively tells the story of being sectioned under the Mental Health Act in 4 years and having to escape to Africa is the only way she could kind of get out of the mental health.
Unbelievable. It sounds like something from a movie, because she had checked herself in, right? Seeking that help and support. And
on a voluntary basis for 2 weeks, and 4 years later, and in
that time, did she have a daughter? I can't remember.
So she had a daughter before. She'd had her daughter before she was sectioned, and she went in for voluntary sort of 2 weeks respite, and then was there for 4 years. Moved to, I think, something like 12 different institutions. So effectively, what we do in Glassmoon Services is we work with people like Alexis, who might have been sectioned in a long stay institution for, we've supported somebody who'd been sectioned for 13 years. So sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, to effectively get a team round about them to work with them and recognise their autism, learning disability,
If they're
neurodivergent, absolutely, to support them in terms of understanding their need. And then our property company will buy a property, purpose refurbish it to make sure it's safe for them to live in that property in the community. And then we put the two bits together so we can support them 24/7. And that's what my team in Cornwall and Plymouth do. And I've got an amazing team led by my managing director, Carole Edmond, who runs that on a day-to-day basis. And we've got 100 colleagues. And we're in the process of hopefully buying another property and supporting somebody else to come out of long stay care.
The transformation that's happening through Glassmoon is amazing. So how would you say, what are like future plans or projects that Glassmoon has in motion to continue to change the status quo?
Yeah, people ask me what is next and how are we going to scale Glassmoon services, and I think it's a tricky question because the work that we're doing is very much on a sort of individual person by person basis, which when you look at that in terms of, okay, what does the growth look like? I don't know that the growth story for Glassmoon services is what I've done in the past in terms of, growing nursery groups to over, 200
Bupa,
locations.
Horizons,
yeah, absolutely. Same when I was the CEO for the Regard Group, we had over 170 services. I think for us, it's about getting it right at the individual person level from a quality, from a human rights, getting it right, because this work is hard to do from the team level perspective, getting the property piece right. For me, it's the digitalization of how do we digitalize every part of that process and system in terms of understanding what works and what doesn't, and how do we capture outcome data that could change people's lives, either in relation to getting people out of long stay institutions and how we create the infrastructure. So it's back to my fixation with creating a social infrastructure in this country to live meaningful lives in the community. You can only do that on a person-by-person basis.
On
but
an
how
individual level.
You can in terms of getting it right because everybody's different and the need is different. But how do we create a scalable model that uses technology and uses data to look at, okay, if we're going to create the infrastructure, what does the infrastructure look like from a property and housing accommodation perspective for the skill set that the team need to have for how you manage risk, how you get it right at that individual person, but you've got the right shared risk from a multidisciplinary team with the NHS and the local authorities who are funding this care and support. So for me, I think the growth of the opportunity is around how do you create that digital and that data infrastructure, and how do you share that collaboratively across the sector, so that people in this country can do what we've done in terms of set up smaller organisations.
But do that at scale.
Yeah, but scale it in terms of, because there's 2005, there's probably more now, people who are locked away in long stay institutions, who it's hard to see how, if we don't create this infrastructure and get it right by that person by person level and meet that individual need, it's hard to see how they're not going to be in long stay institutions in the long term. But also, if you look at the prevalence of autism in young adults, in young adults, and you look at, I sit on the board of N Family Club, which is a fast growing organic nursery group in the UK. And when I'm doing nursery visits, I always, because obviously I have a special interest in autism and neurodivergence and special educational needs. I say, you're seeing more children coming through that require, early intervention. They've got, special educational needs. There's some level of support, speech and language, whatever it might be. And without fail, in every visit, they'll say, yeah, we're seeing more children. Now, that is the incredible part that I think that the nursery can play from an early intervention perspective, because you have parents who are seeing patterns and signs and start to talk to the nursery in terms of, the child requiring additional support or potentially being assessed. But you also have families who don't, who are completely blind to it, who have a blind spot or who are just in denial. And that's where I think the nursery can play an incredibly powerful role in that early intervention piece, which I think is
professional level as well, being able to
absolutely. And again, I think that's where the technology and capturing the data and spotting patterns can play an incredibly powerful and important role in terms of, how do you gather that data? How do you look at it well? How do you support the child? How do you support the team supporting the child in the nursery? And how do you play an important, empathetic role in supporting families to get the help that they need, because we know as children age up, through the educational system, not every school in this country is, whether you're in the state sector or the private sector, is geared up to support children that are neurodivergent or have got, additional needs. And especially when you age into those teenage years, because sometimes we work with young adults who are sort of aging up and are moving from children's services to adult services. And you can just see, the infrastructure, the joined up thinking, the making that a smooth transition. It's not there. And so it's an area that we're sort of focusing on in terms of how can we support in that area, particularly for older teenagers as they age up to adulthood. But families that we work with quite often say to us they've had to fight from the minute it was identified that the child had further needs.
Which is usually identified early on.
Exactly, but when it's identified and they realise that they require further support, they have to fight every step of the way to get the support, to get the funding, to get the help. And I just think that's terribly, terribly sad. We...
nurseries, especially if they're not well equipped to help, kids that are neurodivergent.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the school system, the education system, I think needs to be reshaped, needs to evolve massively to support every child, whether you're neurotypical or neurodivergent. But I think it needs to evolve. And again, I think that's where technology and data can play a huge role in helping with that.
Yeah, huge transformation, and it seems like quite a challenge, but not impossible. As we said earlier, there's a will, there's a way, and I think to every problem there is a solution. Well, I hope that Glassmoon continues to grow, because the things that is happening through Glassmoon, I think, is quite beautiful. And
thank you. And one of the other things we do is we still do some work with where we're asked to go in and look at from a quality due diligence perspective in terms of how children's home groups are performing, or groups in adult services, or very occasionally in early education as well. And I love that particular part of what we do within the group in terms of, because it's an opportunity to see how are companies performing, how are they delivering from a quality and an operational perspective, and again it always develops our thinking in terms of how can we support, whether it's private equity or management teams in terms of for those assets, but it's that ability to kind of see the whole pathway from kind of early education right the way through children's services up to adult services. And I remember a private equity fund asked me a few years ago in terms of, would you ever go, back into a kind of big exec role in terms of, running something? And I said, no, I'm enjoying developing our own organisation and sitting on the boards that I do. But one of the things I'm absolutely fascinated in is how do you join that pathway together from early education, early years through the whole education system, young adults into, adulthood and adult services. And I think there's a real opportunity to join that together from a pathway perspective so that it's much smoother. And again, I know I keep saying this, but this is, I think, where technology and data can help us do that, to create the infrastructure, the social infrastructure in this country where we've just got much more joined up thinking about how we do this, which would make it easier for children, young people and families. And I really hope over the next 10, 20 years, that's what we start to see evolve in this country, because there's so much scope, there's so much potential. And I know everybody talks both in early years children's services and in adult services that there's not enough funding, and I don't think there is, but I also think we could make much better use of the funding that is available to get it to frontline services to support children and young people and families in this country.
Wow, that's quite impactful, and I hope to see this through as well. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope to have you again.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks very much for having me, Priscilla.
Thank you.